Dwayne McDuffie used to tell me stories about being pulled over by cops. Dwayne had had open heart surgery and was concerned about being handcuffed because his sutures would tear if his arms were forced behind his back. How often does this happen? I naively asked. It was a fairly common occurrence to be randomly stopped and asked where he was going. Whose car was he driving? Dwayne drove a champagne SUV. He was 6'6". He told me he would sometimes try to make himself smaller, so he would not intimidate or scare people.
While large in stature, Dwayne McDuffie's legacy and impact can't be captured by focusing on his physical size. The man always brought a certain sense of thoughtfulness to everything he worked on, from Marvel to Milestone, the DC animated universe, and even Ben 10. But to get the full picture, we have to start at a time where Dwayne was much smaller. On February 20th, 1962, Dwayne McDuffie was born to Leroy and Edna Hawkins McDuffie. Dwayne was the second McDuffie child, preceded by an older brother, Brian, who passed away as an infant, and followed by a younger brother, Daryl. Living in Detroit, Dwayne and Daryl had what most would consider a typical middle-class childhood. Leroy, their father, worked for the Federal Reserve, and Edna, their mother, was a nurse. Despite both having decent jobs, the McDuffies would often find themselves working extra shifts in order to afford tuition for Dwayne to attend Roper, a nearby private school for gifted children. If you're a fan of his work, Dwayne's childhood interests may sound a bit similar to one of his most popular characters, Virgil Hawkins, aka Static. Describing himself as a proto-nerd, Dwayne was an avid reader of science fiction and comics. The first issues he had picked out for himself being an issue of DC's comedy series Sugar and Spike, and an Adventures Comics issue featuring the Legion of Superheroes, because it had a bunch of superheroes on the cover, and thus it seemed like that was a better value. Of course, growing up in the 60s meant growing up during the genesis of superhero animation. With the discovery of Marvel's Spider-Man and Fantastic Four, two properties that would leave a lasting effect on Dwayne's future, his love for the genre grew further than just the printed page.
When reflecting on his upbringing, Dwayne would say that his father was an extraordinarily creative man and a gifted storyteller, and surmise that he must have picked up a lot from him, although it wasn't conscious. That love for storytelling would be nurtured through his early life through trips to the bookstore, during which his father would give him a $20 bill and allow him to purchase whatever he was interested in. While we all know that Dwayne would end up working with superheroes, that wasn't always the plan. In fact, Dwayne had always held an interest in science. Throughout his childhood, he was an active participant in his school's science fair events, and passionately wanted to grow up to be an astronaut. In 1975, Dwayne's brilliance was already incredibly evident as he began studying at the University of Michigan at the age of 13. While his love for science was a large motivational factor in his childhood, Dwayne never let that dull his creative spark, and would even work on Super 8 films during his high school and college years. These films, mostly comedic in nature, would typically run about 20 to 40 minutes long and could range from a variety of topics, like spoofing the Adam West Batman in a story where Robin is hot on the heels of a pizza thief, to trying to capture the style of one of Dwayne's biggest influences, Woody Allen, through a mockumentary about the growing menace of big disposable lighter worshipping religious cults.
After high school, McDuffie returned to the University of Michigan in pursuit of a degree in English and another in physics. He graduated in 1983, but that same year, Dwayne learned that his undergraduate research into the properties of thermocouples had been applied to missile guidance systems, a revelation that would ultimately change the trajectory of his life going forward. In his words, "I thought I was doing pure research, and it turned out that it wasn't quite so pure. I had a crisis of conscience and spent a year kind of not doing anything, and decided that the only thing I really enjoyed doing is that I used to make movies for fun." Around this time, Dwayne would ghostwrite science fiction novels and jokes for late night and stand-up comedians, but his writing career didn't really become a focus until 1984. For Dwayne, New York held a certain romance, and being that it was much closer to his family than film schools out in California, he took his chance classes and applied to NYU. After submitting one of his Super 8 films, he was admitted with a partial scholarship. Unfortunately, Dwayne never felt at place in NYU. Film school was a bad fit for me. If you've got 80 grand to spend, you may as well make a movie with the money, rather than blow it on tuition. From his recollection, his work at NYU was dreadful. While he had been making films for fun during his time at University of Michigan, the dynamic had now changed. Dwayne had become too serious, too focused on fulfilling the assignment, rather than using the medium as a form of self-expression. Of course, the stress of film school wasn't the only downside to life in the Big Apple. When discussing the change of scenery years later, Matt Wayne would recall, "I saw taxis pass him by, and the bruises from getting jumped for coming into my Park Slope neighborhood. Not to mention, with big city life comes big city bills."
Eventually, Dwayne ended up having to leave the NYU due to money problems, and a friend of his helped him land a job as a copy editor of the weekly financial publication Investment Dealer's Digest. Or, as he so bluntly put it, the same job you get in the 5th circle of hell as punishment for being sullen. Luckily, this job didn't last long. Through NYU, Dwayne had made friends with Greg Wright, who at the time was working for Marvel Comics. One night at dinner, Dwayne brought up his current employment situation and how much he loathed the job. And as the conversation went on, Greg had told him about an opening at Marvel for an assistant editor. The next morning, Greg had called Dwayne and said that if he came in that day, he can get an interview from Bob Budinsky. Following the interview, Dwayne was offered a job at Marvel. And despite taking a considerable pay cut, he was at least relieved that he can get away from the financial magazine. When working for Marvel, Dwayne helped them launch their first series of trading cards, and left his imprint on many characters that you might know today, like Captain Marvel, She-Hulk, and even Iron Man. However, while he was receiving consistent work writing one-off tales for these characters, there was still friction in the office, with one editor refusing to read any of his pitches, claiming that he was illiterate.
But what that editor didn't know was that Dwayne had already sold multiple pitches to Marvel through different avenues, and in 1989, one of those pitches made its way from a one-shot story in Marvel Age Annual number 4 to its own mini-series. Initially conceived as a cleanup crew for time-traveling police, Damage Control was pitched to Marvel as a sitcom within their comic universe. While on its face, the idea of a construction firm taking care of the aftermath of superhero battles seems as though it's a given, Dwayne used the concept to deconstruct the Marvel world and give commentary on how complex the structure of their shared universe had become over the past 50 years of publication. The idea of a meta-narrative, or a second layer to the events of the story itself, was something Dwayne would often focus on in his writing. Whether it be the deconstruction of the Marvel Universe as seen in Damage Control, or inserting his personal experiences into his next series, 1990's Deathlock. Having referred to the series as his take on Fantastic Four's The Thing, when you peel back the layers of Deathlock's plot, an academic type who receives a job with mega corporation Roxxon, only to discover his work is being used for weapons of war, you can easily see how Dwayne's life up to this point influenced his writing. Not only was he pulling from his personal experience of his 1983 crisis of conscience, but also commenting on the tension of his own pacifistic tendencies coming to a head with a genre where the hero's actions were all but indistinguishable from the villains. On an even deeper level, Dwayne's Deathlock run, titled The Souls of Cyberfolk, was a purposeful homage to W.E.B. Du Bois' book The Souls of Black Folk, a collection of essays on race. Editor Tom Brevoort has gone on record to suggest the title faced pushback and was temporarily retitled Cyber War due to a lack of familiarity with the intended reference. But ultimately, Dwayne was able to keep the original title. To him, this was an important piece of the work, as he used the duality between the black protagonist and the computer as a metaphor for the double consciousness that W.E.B. Du Bois pointed out was an inescapable consequence of being black in America. When speaking on their shared time in the Marvel offices, Brevoort would say, "Dwayne was probably the smartest person working on staff when I started as an office intern. A very gregarious and fun fun-loving person. He was far more plugged into questions of race and representation than anybody else at Marvel in those days. And that caused him to butt up against people when he saw something being done that he thought was ill-informed or just plain wrong. He was never shy about expressing his opinion, and he was deadly with a quip and a sharp line. Because he wasn't happy with the way that characters who looked like him were depicted in comics, Dwayne worked on trying to create better representation for people of all kinds in his work. Perhaps one of the most well-known examples of this discontent was his tongue-in-cheek pitch for Teenage Negro Ninja Thrashers.
In the past year, 25% of all African American superheroes appearing in the Marvel Universe possess skateboard-based powers. In an attempt to remain on the cutting edge of comics, I hereby propose a new series that will fully exploit this exciting new trend.
Teenage Negro Ninja Thrashers. When a group of teenage Negroes find cosmic-powered skateboards, their lives are forever changed. A team of distant characters join together, swearing an oath to use their powers for good. Rocket Racer, a black guy on a skateboard. Night Thrasher, a black guy on a skateboard. Dark Wheelie, a black guy on a skateboard. And their leader, the mysterious black guy on a skateboard known only as that mysterious black guy on a skateboard. This is a surefire hit as it contains all of these popular elements. Circa 1974 clothing and hairstyles, bizarre speech patterns unrecognizable by any member of any culture on the planet.
Yo, what's hip hop happening there, bro?
A smart white friend to help them out of the trouble they get into. They're heroes who could be you. If you were black, I mean. They're on skateboards. They have an attractive white female friend to calm them down when they get too excited. Face it, Pilgrim, this one's got it all.
Have I made my point?
Dwayne's focus on positive representation for people of color remained at the forefront of his career for the rest of his life. So after he stepped down from Marvel staff in 1990 to become a freelancer, he figured if nobody else was gonna do it, then it was up to him.
While Dwayne had been working on concepts like Static in his Marvel years, it wasn't until 1991 that he started putting together what would be known as Milestone Comics. In his mind, he had never wanted to be an entrepreneur, but he felt it was required to make a business just so he can keep creative and editorial control over the characters. So, with the money he received from Deathlock and a 400-page story bible, Dwayne McDuffie, Dennis Cohen, Michael Davis, and Derek T. Dingle set out to turn the world of comics on its head. Over the course of a year, the group negotiated a first-of-its-kind deal with DC, in which the established publisher would help with printing, distribution, and merchandising, so long as the Milestone team would maintain creative control. Once the agreement was reached, DC had the option to not publish a book if it made them uncomfortable, but never to edit it in any way.
With the business aspects taken care of, it was time for Milestone Media to accomplish what they set out to do: destroy the monolith. The way the creators of Milestone saw it, in the landscape of comics in the early 90s, when you were writing a character of color, they were never allowed to just be that character. Due to how few and far between they were, the character was seen as symbolic of that entire group of people as a whole. So, to combat that notion, Milestone's 1993 launch brought to life a black conservative man named Icon, a young black nerd known as Static, a team called the Blood Syndicate with members from all kinds of backgrounds, and an angry black man named Hardware. To Dwayne, Hardware was the anti-Deathlock. While Deathlock represented what he described to be the idealized version of himself, Hardware represented his self-doubt, who he was afraid he might be. In fact, all of these characters were deeply personal to the team behind them. As Dwayne mentioned in an interview with Wizard Magazine, he believed that people write about themselves. Basically, fundamentally, no matter what character you're writing, there has to be a core of you in it. Unfortunately, in a world sparse of black characters, for black men creating comics that reflected their experiences meant instant pushback.
99.9% of comic book companies up to that point had been owned and run by white males. So when we came out and announced we were going to do some comics and it was for black men, it's like, oh, okay, it's black comics. And it's hard to fight that image.
Despite the stigma of being black comics, Milestone intended their brand to reflect the real world, and thus marketed themselves as a multicultural company. And as the company grew, their team expanded to include people from various backgrounds. Despite this, the dismissal of their stories still persisted. In some cases, retailers would even refuse to carry their books, claiming they were racist against white people. Regardless of the naysayers, Milestone continued to publish over 250 unique books over 4 years, and at one point even crossed over with the Superman cast of DC's main characters during the comic event Worlds Collide. Despite shuttering their comic book division by 1997, Dwayne would always view this experience as the largest accomplishment of his professional life. And when asked which of his work he would like to be the first thing that a new fan may experience, would answer Icon, A Hero's Welcome, the trade collection of the series' first 8 issues. Over the next few years, Dwayne would continue to write in comics and even tried to pitch a damage control movie, which ultimately landed in production hell following the events of 9/11. But what he didn't know was somewhere in LA, a pitch was happening that would soon change his life.
Going as far back as 1993, there were attempts to turn the characters of Milestone's Dakotaverse into animated properties. DC editor-in-chief Jeanette Kahn was convinced that the characters would be great for cartoons, and with the blessing of the Milestone team, started working on a few pitches. One pitch, titled The New Guard, was envisioned as an animated version of a team book in the same vein as the X-Men. The first script for the pitch wasn't the quality that anyone involved was hoping for, and as a result, Batman the Animated Series producer Alan Burnett was brought in for a second pass. According to Dwayne, when Alan was brought on board, he got it. He really seemed to like the characters. He understood what Milestone was doing. It was a wonderful, wonderful script. He wrote the single best Icon introduction scene that Dwayne had ever seen. But regardless of how good a pitch can be, that doesn't necessarily mean it will ever come to life. And while Milestone was in its heyday, an animated series just didn't seem to be in the cards. However, the execs didn't give up and kept looking for Milestone pitches. Some of the proposed ideas included Icon, an 8,000-year-old alien, being portrayed as a 15-year-old, a live-action Static with the kid from Home Improvement, and at one point, there was even a pitch where Static would have been adopted by a white family. By the new millennium, Alan Burnett finally had a Static pitch that was approved, and Static Shock was born, bringing a small pocket of the Dakotaverse to network television. Almost immediately, Alan suggested that Dwayne McDuffie needed to be on board as a writer, so story editor Stan Berkowitz called him up and offered a job on the show. Initially, there was a sense of hesitance on Dwayne's inclusion due to a lack of animation writing experience, but after turning in the script for his first episode, Burnett was of the mind that Dwayne's output would very much influence the direction of the rest of the series going forward.
Like the comic series it was based on, Static Shock wasn't always just concerned with the superhero action, but would often try to use its stories to teach a message to the audience. Most of the shows of this nature would feel safer using allegories and subtext, or when directly addressing these topics, play it very safe. Static Shock chose to focus on these issues directly, and let the dangers of these topics and how it affected people show how real these stories could be. I mean, sometimes these conflicts were even more terrifying than your typical supervillain flying around and shooting laser blasts, because these dangers felt real. They felt like they could happen right now in your very neighborhood. Perhaps the most famous example would be the second season finale titled Jimmy, which focused on gun violence. During development, television restrictions were a challenge, but Dwayne felt that Kids WB made a great move allowing them to even do the episode in the first place. He appreciated how they were actually able to show a regular cast member getting shot and react to this pain realistically.
Oh, it hurts! It's not like on TV.
Dwayne was able to do this episode his way and show the true dangers of misuse of firearms without being too preachy about it. This episode won the 2003 Hematinus Prize in Children's Animation. By season 3, Dwayne penned one of his favorite scripts, Static in Africa, an episode that acted as a direct commentary on his views of the African American experience. One of Dwayne's biggest beliefs in writing for animation was that if you were going to do an educational, message-based program, you can put it in a documentary on a channel nobody watches. But if you really wanted to get that message across, you need to put it in the media that everybody's watching. With this train of thought, despite this episode being a straightforward superhero team-up, it's also filled to the brim with historical facts on African culture.
Check it out. What's that?
Independence Monument. The Black Star represents African freedom from colonialism.
But even then, those pieces of trivia weren't the totality of the final message, as the narrative focus was on the emotional struggles of being a minority separated from your own people. While white America has a subconscious sense of unity and peace, them being the majority, that's unfortunately not the typical experience of people of color. Dwayne felt this was important to get across not only in a way that would help the black members of the audience feel represented, but also in a way that would help white members of the audience empathize with a struggle they may not have thought of before.
I've been carrying this weight around all my life without knowing it, and now it's gone. In Africa, I'm not a black kid. I'm just a kid. Is this what it feels like for you all the time?
Yeah, I guess.
And of course, I can't talk about this episode without touching on Anansi, an African superhero based on a West African/Caribbean folktale character. He's described to be a trickster god, usually taking the form of a spider. But while his trickster powers are used very creatively and excessively, Dwayne was able to make this character work without ever actually turning him into a spider in the episode. Whether intentionally or not, this move served to subvert an unfortunately commonplace trope in media that dehumanizes people of color by having them shapeshift into animal counterparts. Instead, Anansi is used as a beacon of hope and confirmation for Virgil as his identity as a black superhero.
I never knew how important it would be to meet a role model like you. A black superhero. I don't know, it validates me somehow.
You don't feel as real if you don't see yourself reflected in the media, Dwayne told the Chicago Sun-Times in 1993. There's something very powerful about seeing yourself represented.
Biggest issue generally in writing mainstream comics is if you write a black character, he represents blackness, and that's ridiculous. If you write a white character, he's that guy. You know, you can be Superman, you can be Lex Luthor, but if you're black, you're all black people. Good guy, bad guy, anything in between.
But despite the aim to take real-life conflicts seriously, it was important to Dwayne that Static always remained fun at its core, and audience responded to this pretty greatly. Static Shock was a huge success for its time, estimating about 3 to 4 million viewers 5 days a week. It was the #2 show when it aired on Cartoon Network, just behind Family Guy. Dwayne claimed it had higher ratings than Justice League, Teen Titans, or anything else that he's ever worked on. However, this success seemed to have its limits tested, as around the 4th season there was a regime change in production. Network meddling changed the show around, and this drove Dwayne crazy. After Static's 3rd season, the one that Dwayne connected with the most, he was ready to jump right into the 4th season. He had a lot of plans for it and wanted to continue to use the series to have his voice be heard. But the network insisted on changes with the intention to improve the show. And while Dwayne understood this, he felt that they didn't really understand his vision anymore, and it ultimately made the show worse. A lot of his season 4 work was rejected, much to Dwayne's annoyance. One particular network note that he received and expressed irritation literally said, "What if you save the president in an airplane?" as if this has never been done before. Dwayne took these changes with as much grace as he could, as he knew a lot of the people in charge and knew where their focus was. The issue is that their focus and the show's focus didn't line up.
While Dwayne and the Static Shock team did everything they could to make sure people of all backgrounds were able to see themselves on TV, unfortunately, that message never carried across to store shelves. Despite consistently crushing in the ratings, outside a set of Subway Kids meal toys during the show's final season, 2 Scholastic children books, and a canceled Game Boy Advance game, Static Shock never saw the merchandising push that many shows of similar stature were given.
It's pretty valuable.
Captain Dwayne's decoder ring?
It's a collector's item.
While he had asserted at times that it was unclear as to why merchandisers weren't actively trying to capitalize on the show's success, despite other characters and properties of much lower name recognition receiving merchandising deals left and right, Dwayne seemed very convinced that it had to do with Static's skin color. He's black, so he doesn't have a toy line, which makes him less profitable than other shows with far fewer viewers. Despite the animation industry being one of Dwayne's first experiences of being treated well in the workplace, there were still aspects of the business that weren't willing to see past skin color. With animation being produced at a loss, this lack of merchandising meant Warner Brothers was taking a huge gamble continuing to produce the show. So, once 52 episodes were in the can, the studio pulled the plug and attempted to recover some of the money through syndication deals. Luckily, the end of Static wouldn't be the end of Dwayne's days writing animation. Lo and behold, during the show's run, there were plenty of other cartoons being produced by Warner Brothers. And while Dwayne McDuffie was there, he was offered jobs to write one-off scripts for What's New Scooby-Doo and Teen Titans. But the biggest offer he received could probably best be described as an accident. Over in the Justice League offices, the team was busy plucking away at their first season. Paul Dini and Rich Fogel had just put the finishing touches on their outline for the Gorilla Grodd episode, The Brave and the Bold. But as luck would have it, when it was time to go to script, Paul would end up with a hand injury. Rich, having other responsibilities on his plate that needed to be tended to, gave Dwayne McDuffie a call. Oddly enough, since he was living in Florida at the time, away from the action, Dwayne didn't even know Rich, or really anybody on the Justice League crew, and has said in interviews that he suspects the call was the result of Alan Burnett floating his name. One script turned into another, and eventually, when the show's second season began production, Dwayne was brought out to California to not only be a writer for the show, but also a story editor. When speaking of his experience with Justice League, Dwayne would say, "To go from working on characters I helped create to working on cultural institutions like Superman and Batman has been one of the biggest thrills of my professional life."
He was even later joined by Matt Wayne, his best friend from his Milestone days, after Bruce Timm suggested him for the team. But as fun as the Justice League was to work on, Dwayne wanted to make sure that his influence had a strong impact. He pushed hard to flesh out the League as individual characters. In his words, he described, "They were kind of a bunch of stiffs. The Justice League is a 1950s property. They had no personalities. You can take the dialogue from any character and put it on any other character and it didn't matter. So when we started the Justice League series, there was a tendency to stay in that. Like there wasn't enough differentiation between the characters." Dwayne made a hard case to separate them, figure them out, and see what made them individuals. This was his focus all throughout the season, and Dwayne feels this greatly benefited the show. Dwayne was very happy with the way the characters were expanded upon with his involvement. But although the mission was accomplished and the characters are now well-rounded, now it's time to challenge them. Dwayne wanted to put these newly fleshed out characters in scenarios that would challenge their feelings and motivations. He wanted to see if these new character archetypes would hold true through conflict or crumble down. Dwayne aimed to ask how strong and how sure is a character in who they are and what they stand for.
Following the finale of Justice League, Cartoon Network decided they wanted more, and thus Justice League Unlimited was born, with Dwayne McDuffie now being promoted from story editor to producer. Originally, JLU was conceptualized as an anthology show in which one of the characters from the original show would go on weekly adventures with a handful of the new heroes that were brought to the table. As time went on, the producers would come to realize that not only could they make their scripts much more dense than the original Justice League series, but also, after a few episodes were in the can, they would reach the realization that there were clear breakout characters and themes that they wanted to follow up on. For an ongoing storyline like Justice League Unlimited's Cadmus arc, Dwayne would be the first to tell you the entire thing was a collaborative effort. "We all sit in a room and we argue about every piece of everything. We go through it beat by beat, and the guy who writes the first draft, as far as I'm concerned, gets the credit." But while it's important to understand the team dynamic in the writer's room, Dwayne's contributions to Unlimited can't be understated.
Dwayne was not ignorant to some of the criticisms this series had, a popular opinion being that the previous series had better use of its character development with only 7 characters to focus on. Dwayne, however, felt differently about this. He felt the newer stories could expand on the characters in ways that the previous show couldn't, and by now, as they're more experienced in writing these characters, they can write better stories for them. The previous Justice League series, with its hour-long storytelling, he declared took too much time to set up the next grand plotline, and focus was steered towards making each pair of episodes feel like mini-movies. It was getting difficult to continue to try to outdo the previous story every time. Whereas in Unlimited, the half-hour storylines force them to focus more on the characters, and allows the writers to be less worried about writing the next epic plotline. At the end of the day, Dwayne considered both Justice League and Unlimited to be a big success. He couldn't believe how well the original series turned out, and was very satisfied with his work in the DC animated universe.
From the first set of 26 episodes alone, Dwayne is credited as writer for nearly half of them, has story credits for another 4, and as producer, was responsible for story editing on all of the scripts. Suffice to say, without his contributions, Justice League Unlimited could have ended up a completely different show. In fact, for an example of how much Dwayne's absence could affect the outcome of a show, you have to look no further than Ben 10.
In 2005, Dwayne revealed on his forums that he was actually involved with the early development of Ben 10. While not much is known about his involvement, this could have been around the time when the show was originally called Force 10 or Ben to the 10th. These versions of the series focused on Ben turning into alternate versions of himself, or turning into superheroes as opposed to aliens. But as we know today, Ben 10 ended up moving in a different direction. The series focused on 10-year-old Ben Tennyson as he turned into aliens using the Omnitrix, saving the day one motorhome pit stop at a time. While the series was a huge success, it's interesting to think about how the series would have turned out during his involvement, though the next iteration of the show ended up answering those speculations, as the first series, now retroactively referred to as Ben 10 Classic, was coming to an end. Dwayne was brought on to work on Ben 10 Alien Force, centered around Ben and his team in their teenage years. He was hired to do for Ben 10 what he did to Justice League, put the spotlight on character development, story arcs, and humanizing conflict. Even the art style was changed to resemble the DC cartoons in hope of invoking the same feeling. Many of Dwayne's previous colleagues have moved to this show, including his best friend, Matt Wayne. Dwayne's influence was very prominent in the tone of Alien Force. He personally wrote the first 3 episodes, every season finale, and some important stories in between. Dwayne's dedication to bringing Ben 10 to life in his vision was enlightening, and many fans agree that these first 2 seasons of Alien Force were the peak of Ben 10 in its entire franchise. While the classic series was entertaining, internationally successful, and loved for both its characters and the adventures they went on, it had its limitations. These limitations didn't really hold the show back overall, but it prevented certain aspects developing that could have definitely used some expanding. A major factor was the series took place during a cross-country road trip, making the supporting cast of characters and reoccurring villains nearly impossible to accommodate without stretching coincidences here and there. Alien Force took place primarily in Ben's hometown and its surrounding locations. The series was able to take advantage of this setting by expanding its cast greatly, which helped include more diverse characters with their own backstories and personalities.
Whatever we were before, today we're a team. We look out for each other. We win or lose together.
The world building was also elevated to a galactic level, quite literally too. With established locations on Earth and different locales in space, there was a lot of room for new ideas and stories. Dwayne aimed to make sure that his crew was also in line with his new version of the show. Jim Craig, a fellow writer on the show, had this to say about Dwayne. "Whenever I had a pitch to work out, I would ride my bike over to Dwayne's place and pitch it to him first. He listened patiently and gave me brilliant pointers. Or just tear the thing down and help me build it again from scratch." Dwayne wasn't afraid to change the work of others to benefit the story, but he always approached it very encouragingly. Having a positive influence and relationship with all of the writers helped the series feel cohesive. Fans were very invested in this new, more concrete world too. By this time, Dwayne was very active on his website's forums, where he would answer questions about all of his works, but was mostly overflooded with inquiries about Ben 10. Fans were able to have missed mysteries of the series solved by Dwayne himself, be teased with witty and cryptic responses for what's to come, and hear his own personal opinion on what it's like developing the series, which was almost exclusively positive. It was nearly impossible to see this new path of Ben 10 take a wrong turn. That is, until you reintroduce one of Dwayne's oldest and most pressing nemeses: executive meddling. Although Alien Force was regarded as a clear success by both fans and critics alike, ratings were not quite as high as the classic series. This of course isn't any fault of Dwayne's or even the series itself, but Ben 10 was conceptualized and founded on the fact that it would use the show to sell action figures and toys to the audience. And as the franchise has already been active for quite a few years, many fans just aged out of the toy buying demographic, and the more serious, mature tone of Alien Force was deemed too alienating to reel in new, younger fans. Like Static Shock, Dwayne had many plans for Alien Force's final season before it was rejected by the network. Some of these plans involved including a Hulk-style storyline for Kevin and his mutations, revisiting that obviously dropped Dragon plotline from the first season, and a Cthulhu-inspired arc that would involve the character Vilgax and his resemblance. This is when the crew was instructed to backpedal and, quote, make the show more like the first series, as the network felt in doing so would bring in the younger kids. Dwayne had to reconstruct the third season from the ground up. He had to write with the intention to emulate a world that goes against the world he was building the past 26 episodes. As passionate as Dwayne is about characterization and storytelling, it's hard to imagine he was pleased with this decision. Ben was reworked to resemble his classic series personality again, replacing the character development from seasons 1 and 2 with a 10-year-old personality.
You're completely full of yourself.
Which is forgivable because I'm so adorable.
All of the plot lines for the third season were dropped, with the only surviving idea being to reintroduce Vilgax, although in completely different circumstances. This network decision ultimately backfired, as this season started the slow decline of Ben 10's reputation. Instead of gaining new fans, this immediate tonal shift only served to turn away the long-time, dedicated fans of the show. The seasonal arc was reduced, characters became more regressed and flanderized, and the special spark that made the DCAU special that was brought over to give Ben 10 the same feeling has long since diminished. When Ben 10's third iteration of the series came along, subtitled Ultimate Alien, news about the show's development was widely reduced, and as a result, not much is known about what the show's core is supposed to be. Dwayne seemed less open about the behind-the-scenes developments on his forums, and the series came off as trying to find a balance between the first two seasons of Alien Force and the third. The series had asymmetrically shifted between taking itself seriously and at times being even more lighthearted and goofier than the classic series. They had finally had a chance to include their Vilgax Cthulhu storyline and Kevin's mutations, but by then it was too late. Their original plans had far since spoiled. However, Dwayne never stopped pushing for the best storytelling that he could. Dwayne's writing was always at its best when he can use it to reflect the problems in the real world. But unlike Static, Ben 10 was just a little too sci-fi to play some of these straight. When developing the episode Prisoner Number 775 is Missing, Peter David, a fellow writer of the series, recalled Dwayne's pitch about reflecting Guantanamo Bay, a United States prison established in 2002 by President Bush, where prisoners, to this day, are kept and tortured without trial. Dwayne was outraged that this prison existed in the first place. He felt that President Obama was dragging out the prison's shutdown. Peter stated, "The notion that people could be held indefinitely with no trial, no sentencing, just on suspicion, Dwayne was furious over it. It was as if the government had lost sight of what America was supposed to represent." These themes were the driving point of the episode, with Area 51 acting as a stand-in for the prison.
It's a holding facility. Alien combatants who landed on Earth over the years.
You've had people in there for 50 years?
Not people. Aliens, held on suspicion of being a threat to planetary security.
This episode centered around an alien that was stranded on Earth, stripped of his rights, and held prisoner for 50 years without trial. The prisoner was actually part of his planet's revolution, and during his absence as he was trapped on Earth, the revolution on his home planet was lost.
My mate, my children, gone. All gone.
Nothing will ever be okay again!
This drove the prisoner mad, and after escaping and plotting his revenge on the colonel in charge of Area 51, he was overwhelmed with his prison experiences and ended up begging Ben to kill him and put him out of his misery.
Do it! Finish me! Come on! Let me join my family! Do it! Do it! Finish me. I've got nothing.
Some threat, huh?
As production for Ultimate Alien was coming to a close, Dwayne had already had his sights set on the future, developing the 4th iteration of Ben 10, Ben 10 Omniverse. All of the writing was done for Ultimate Alien, and now it was time to retool the series again, this time with Ben armed with a new, official Omnitrix, and a brand new partner fresh out of the academy.
Simultaneously to his work on Ben 10, Dwayne made a return to the world of comics in a big way. Despite having expressed a lack of faith that he would ever have the opportunity just 2 years prior, in 2007, McDuffie became the author for DC's Justice League of America, picking up at issue number 13 where former author Brad Meltzer left off. Of course, any reasonable fan saw this as excellent news. One of the men who helped steer the ship for what was arguably the most thoughtful superhero cartoon at the time was going to be writing Justice League, and he had years worth of comic book writing experience to fall back on? That sounded like a dream come true. But of course, that assumes that the vocal parts of comic book fandom over a decade ago were rational. And, well,
I think being a writer that the reader knows is black. The phrase I get all the time is I'm always trying to shove my agenda down their throat, which seems sexually charged to me. I don't know. But I came on to Justice League after a very successful run. During that run, they had added 2 black members to the team. I was told right up front, bring the Black Green Lantern in, bring in Firestorm, who's a kind of a young Spider-Man-ish superhero who's a black college kid. And I'm like, oh, great, okay. Before I knew it, I had broken what I call the rule of 3. That rule is, in popular entertainment, if there are 3 black people in it, it is a black product. And somebody, I think the artist did a pinup with all the black characters, and somebody leaked it and said, that's the cover. McDuffie's going to turn the Justice League all black. He's getting rid of the white guys, you know. Never a plan, never even considered, but it freaked people out, so they're reading the stuff looking for proof. There is a hardcore piece of the audience whose back goes up whenever you go into these issues, and they don't even realize it. And what kills me about it is when they're writing about it, they're always hyper-rational. Look, the fact is there are more white characters, and if you picked randomly, you would end up with all white teams. And the fact that there are 3 black people on this team is statistically ridiculous. It's obviously a quota. Crack me up, because who's actually, I'm sorry, somebody ain't losing a job here? Which fictional character is losing a job? They're not talking about what's going on in the comic books. They're talking about what they think is going on in their lives, and that's not really going on either. Fundamental thing that we're getting out of the genre. It's very much a power fantasy, it's very much a male power fantasy, it's very much a white power fantasy. If I write, as I have many times, a story where Daredevil, who doesn't have powers, gets the drop on Thor, who has unbelievable powers, people go, oh, that's so cool, Daredevil was so clever. If I have the Black Panther do the same thing, that's impossible. It's like I write Batman all the time where he's hanging out with 7 guys who by any logic should be able to, you know, eat his lunch without even working up a sweat. And he's constantly outmaneuvering them and outfighting them and outthinking them, and we think Batman is so cool. But when black characters do much less relative to where their positions are, it makes the readership uncomfortable because they're not used to seeing it.
Despite the backlash, Dwayne remained on the series for a 21-issue run over 2 years until ultimately being canned for being a bit more open with behind-the-scenes information than DC Comics was comfortable with. But 2009 wasn't all bad news. In fact, in May that year, it was announced that Dwayne McDuffie and animation writer Charlotte Fullerton were getting married. The two had been set up by mutual friends Matt Wayne and Eugene Sun after the two realized that they would often hang out in groups of 3, but never with both Charlotte and Dwayne together. The two hit it off immediately as their first 1-hour lunch date turned into a 5-hour discussion about life, travel, and things the two held in common. By that October, Dwayne had married the love of his life.
If you look at all the pictures that you'll find of Dwayne, you're going to see a very serious guy. He holds himself in a very serious way, and he doesn't smile, and he's telling you something intelligent. And all the pictures after he and Charlotte get together, he's smiling.
I mean, I'm so taken how happy he and Charlotte seemed. I met her with him before they were married, and I liked her. And she obviously gave him so much. And he her.
During his time on Ben 10, Dwayne would still dive back into the DC universe every now and then, writing a handful of animated films. This included notable works such as Justice League Doom, Justice League Crisis on Two Earths, and the video game Justice League Heroes. But what may have been the script Dwayne was most proud of was his animated adaptation of All-Star Superman, deemed by Dwayne as, perhaps, the best Superman story out there.
For anyone who knows of Dwayne McDuffie, you already know where this story is headed. 4 days after the premiere of All-Star Superman, 1 day after his 49th birthday, Dwayne McDuffie passed away at Providence St. Joseph Medical Center in Burbank, California, due to complications after undergoing emergency heart surgery.
Dwayne would never get a chance to see his final film, the last handful of episodes of Ben 10 Ultimate Alien, and what would become of his work put into the 4th series, Ben 10 Omniverse. The final episode of Ultimate Alien ended with a smile from Ben and a dedication to Dwayne McDuffie. While production for Ben 10 Omniverse continued after Dwayne had passed, he received credits for the first 2 episodes, his last credits on the franchise.
I'm not sure I can ever watch the movie again without him. It was already sad enough with him. But the one scene that I just love and that gets me every single time is between Clark and his mom. And it's so simple and understated and genuine in terms of human emotion. I didn't know, because I hadn't read the All-Star Superman book, that wasn't originally in there. That's something Dwayne created, and that's the part that really resonated the most with me.
If I'm being honest, I've been struggling with figuring out a conclusion to this piece. So I wanted to take a second and read what his dear friend Matt Wayne had to say. You're probably wondering, insomniac or not, how could one guy do so much? I think his brain was simply overclocked. You know, when a computer is tweaked to boost the processor speed, no matter the risk to the components from extra heat and voltage, like that. Not to imply that Dwayne thought himself to death. The other way around. I suspect that Dwayne was so driven because he knew he might burn out early. His father's family had a host of health concerns, and Dwayne's father himself only made it to 48. Dwayne's younger brother died at 43 after more than 25 years of dialysis. But for all I know, Dwayne was simply battling his inner demons. He said more than once that his sleeplessness stemmed from nightmares, which abated after he met his wife Charlotte. But his medical pathology wasn't the only thing that Dwayne got from his father. He also got something to write about. Deathlock, the Marvel Comics killing machine that Dwayne had a hand in revamping, often said, "You've got to do what's right, not what's easiest." That incredibly heroic refrain was a direct quote of Dwayne's father, Lee McDuffie, and what it takes to be a man, to live up to high expectations, is a theme that Dwayne revisited often. He took pains to walk that walk himself. Dwayne did what was right and not easiest. He knew that whatever he did in comics would be dismissed as genre fiction, so he embraced that. He challenged our worldview, but so subtly that we could ignore it and watch the explosions if that's all we wanted. He entertained us first and brought us to a new place so cleverly and so seamlessly that many readers thought they'd seen it coming. He broadened our idea of who gets to be the hero, and he was generous with his advice in support of comic pros of every stripe who followed him. This incredibly gifted, giving, and of course accomplished man died on February 21st, 2011, aged 49 years and 1 day. He had broken through glass ceilings, dazzled millions with his television work, and thousands more with his comics work, given 100 interviews about writing, art, and multiculturalism, and served as the creative engine of his comics company, Milestone Media, which will forever be a beacon of multiculturalism. Matt's piece goes on from there, and we'll link it below, along with a whole slew of other pieces on Dwayne, ranging from videos from our friends to interviews he's done, and anything else in between. But I wanted to stop here because the very next line in the article is, and it'll probably also be forever that incurious people will dismiss Milestone as black comics. And perhaps Matt may be right here, but I'm not sure that I agree. Maybe I have a little more faith in how McDuffie's legacy will live on, because unlike Matt, I wasn't there side by side with him the whole ride, witnessing the roadblocks along the way. So I don't have the first-hand experience to be disheartened from. But I look at the nationwide conversations that we've had surrounding the black experience in America, following the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Elijah McClain, Philando Castile, all the way back to Trayvon Martin. I look at how Dwayne left his stamp on the largest movie franchise of all time with Damage Control. How the people he loved and worked with have carried their experience with him and put it into their writing and day-to-day lives. How the fans of Static Shock poured out their love for the series over the past couple of weeks, becoming one of the largest trending topics on Twitter when it came to HBO Max. How different the landscape of superheroes has grown in recent years, with greater inclusion of characters of color and audiences experiencing the genre from the viewpoints of those that they may not have had the chance to while Dwayne was still here with us. I see all these things, and I can't help but think, Dwayne McDuffie did that. He lived that life. And even though he isn't still physically here with us in this plane of existence, his work and legacy live on. Maybe, like Matt suggested, there will still be incurious people for the rest of forever. But I can't look at Dwayne's life work and where we are now 10 years later and think that there's ever again going to be enough of them that it matters what they think about Milestone Comics. You know, the strange thing is, outside of reading the occasional Milestone book for video research, I've never actually made a point to sit down with the material and really live in that world. Something I realized while writing this script, though, is that there's been a copy of Icon, A Hero's Welcome, that I picked up from Goodwill a few years back, sitting on my shelf untouched. Given that Dwayne said he'd want this to be the entry point for anyone looking to read his work, I think it's time for me to finally give it a try.
You showed me everything I needed to know so I could go on without you. I just hope I've shown them the same. Do you miss him?
Every day. But his spirit is always with us.